Nothing hurts more than standing at the edge of your life and realizing you've built nothing worth remembering. David Marshall Bennett understood this truth with brutal clarity as he stood before the rusted iron gates of Hartwell Manor on that gray October morning. At 62 years old, with hands calloused from decades of substitute teaching and a heart worn thin by loss, he held three things: a crumpled demolition notice, a brass key that felt heavier than it should, and the creeping certainty that this inheritance was just another burden he couldn't afford to carry. The mansion loomed before him like a monument to failure. 3 stories of Victorian architecture, once grand, now surrendering to time's patient assault. Paint peeled from the elaborate trim in long, curling strips. Windows on the upper floors were broken or boarded over with weathered plywood. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of neglect, its ornate railings listing at dangerous angles. Vines strangled the turrets, and the front steps had cracked so severely that grass grew through the fissures. A sign wired to the gate read, "Condemned. Demolition scheduled January 15, 2026. 90 days." That's all the time David had to decide what to do with a property that required at least $300,000 in repairs just to meet code. The demolition notice estimated the cost of tearing it down at $45,000, money he didn't have. His entire life savings amounted to $18,000, most of which would disappear into next year's living expenses if he was careful. If he wasn't careful, it might last 6 months. David pushed open the gate. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that echoed across the 3-acre property and disturbed a family of crows that had taken residence in the ancient oak trees lining the approach. The trees themselves were magnificent, easily 100 years old, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the morning light into shifting patterns of shadow and pale gold. He wondered if Edmund Hartwell had planted them himself back in 1898, if the railroad tycoon had stood here imagining a legacy that would last generations. Instead, the property had become a graveyard of ambition. The driveway was more pothole than pavement weeds, growing tall enough to brush against David's knees as he walked. To his right, barely visible through the overgrowth, stood the caretaker's cottage where his Uncle Harold had lived for more than 40 years. The small structure was locked and boarded now, as forgotten as the man who died there 3 weeks ago at the age of 83. David had barely known Harold. They'd met perhaps 5 times in David's entire life, awkward visits in the 1970s when David was a boy, and Harold had seemed more interested in the mansion's history than in family connections. Even then, Harold had been odd, speaking in riddles, and spending his days documenting the estate's decay with meticulous notes and photographs. When the lawyer had called 2 weeks ago to inform David that he'd inherited the entire property, David's first reaction had been confusion, followed quickly by a sense of cosmic irony. Of course he'd inherit something worthless. It matched everything else in his life. The memory of that meeting in the lawyer's office still stung. Attorney Jameson, a thin man in his 50s with reading glasses that kept sliding down his nose, had read the will, with the detached efficiency of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times before. "To my nephew, David Marshall Bennett, I leave the property known as Hartwell Manor and all structures thereon. With this guidance, true wealth is never found, only earned by those willing to see beyond what others have given up on. The house remembers. Listen to it." David had sat there in the uncomfortable chair, trying to process what this meant. He'd asked the obvious question, why him. Jameson had shrugged, adjusted his glasses, and said that Harold had been quite specific. He'd watched David from afar, the lawyer explained, and believed David reminded him of someone. Who, Jameson couldn't say. Harold hadn't elaborated, and now he never would. Standing on the front porch now, David fumbled with the brass key. The door was solid oak, 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and its surface carved with intricate patterns that had once been beautiful but were now obscured by grime and peeling varnish. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been maintained even as everything else crumbled. The door swung inward with a long, low groan. The foyer took David's breath away. Despite the decay, despite the thick layer of dust covering every surface, the space retained an undeniable majesty. The ceiling soared 20 feet overhead, decorated with intricate plasterwork that depicted scenes from classical mythology. A grand staircase curved upward, its mahogany banister dulled but intact, each baluster hand-carved with a different pattern. Stained glass windows flanked the door, casting colored light across the floor in shades of deep blue and crimson. Dust motes danced in the beams, thousands of tiny particles suspended in the still air, like stars in a forgotten galaxy. David stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his footsteps echoing off the bare walls. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the scale of the place. This was what failure looked like when it had been standing for 100 years. Just like me, he thought. Still upright, but barely. He moved through the ground floor slowly, his shoes leaving prints in the dust. The formal dining room featured a massive stone fireplace that could have accommodated a man standing upright inside it. Built-in china cabinets lined one wall, their glass doors intact but their shelves empty. A single dining table remained long enough to seat 14 people, its surface warped from water damage but still solid. David ran his hand along the wood and felt a strange pang of loss for dinners that had been shared here, conversations that had filled this space with life and laughter. The library was next, and here David paused longer. The room was perhaps 20 feet square with built-in bookshelves rising 12 feet to the ceiling on 3 walls. Most of the shelves were empty, but scattered volumes remained leather-bound books with titles in Latin and Greek. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its leather top cracked and faded but still imposing. In the corner stood a globe on a brass stand, its surface showing countries and borders that no longer existed, geographical snapshots of a world that had reorganized itself multiple times since this map was drawn. David picked up one of the remaining books. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the text was still legible. It was a treatise on railroad engineering published in 1895. He set it down carefully and moved to the windows. They looked out over the rear gardens, which had gone completely wild. What had once been formal landscaping was now a tangle of overgrown shrubs and trees, paths disappearing under decades of unchecked growth. The kitchen, when he reached it, looked like a museum exhibit from the 1950s. Someone, probably Harold, had updated the space mid-century, installing a mint green refrigerator, a white enamel stove, and metal cabinets that were now spotted with rust. The sink was porcelain, deep and wide, with separate faucets for hot and cold water. Both dripped steadily, the sound marking time in the empty house. David tried the taps and got nothing but air and a groan from the pipes. The plumbing would need to be completely replaced. He was about to leave the kitchen when something caught his eye. The wallpaper near the pantry was peeling badly, hanging in long strips that revealed the plaster beneath. But in one section where the paper had come away completely, David could see something unusual. The wall beneath wasn't smooth plaster. It had texture patterns, as if someone had carved directly into the wood. David moved closer, pulling at a loose section of wallpaper. It came away easily, releasing a small cloud of dust that made him cough. Underneath, carved into the wooden wall with extraordinary precision, were symbols and patterns. Not random scratches, but deliberate designs that formed a complex geometric puzzle. David pulled away more of the wallpaper, working carefully, and the full scope of the carving revealed itself. The symbols covered nearly the entire pantry wall, arranged in a series of concentric circles with smaller symbols radiating outward. Some looked like mathematical equations. Others resembled compass roses or star charts. There were Greek letters, Roman numerals, and patterns that seemed to be some kind of code or cipher. And in the center of it all, carved deeper than the rest, was a single word in elegant script: begin. David stood there staring at the wall, his heart beating faster than it had in months. This wasn't random. This wasn't the work of someone passing time with idle carving. This was intentional, methodical, the product of hours or perhaps days of careful labor. Someone had created this and then hidden it behind wallpaper, preserving it for future discovery. He pulled out his phone and took photographs, trying to capture the entire wall from multiple angles. The light from the dirty kitchen window wasn't great, but he could see enough in the images to confirm what his eyes were telling him. These symbols meant something. They were a message or a map or a puzzle waiting to be solved. The discovery changed something in David. He'd come to the mansion that morning, carrying the weight of resignation, already half convinced that he'd have to let the place be demolished and walk away with nothing but the memory of another failure. But standing in front of this carved wall, seeing the word begin, staring back at him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: curiosity. Purpose. The faint stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this inheritance than a crumbling building and impossible debt. He thought about Harold's cryptic message in the will. The house remembers. Listen to it. Had his uncle known about these carvings? Had he spent 40 years in that caretaker's cottage, Knowing that the mansion held secrets, waiting for someone who would take the time to look, David spent another hour exploring the upper floors. There were 8 bedrooms on the second level, most of them damaged by water infiltration from the failing roof. The master bedroom occupied the entire east wing with tall windows that offered a view of the overgrown gardens and the town of Millbrook beyond. The 4-poster bed frame remained its dark wood still solid despite the years. The ceiling in one corner had collapsed, exposing rotted beams and water-stained insulation that would need to be completely replaced. The third floor was worse. Several rooms were completely unusable, their floors unstable, and their walls showing signs of structural damage. David didn't venture far, worried that the floorboards might give way beneath him. This level alone would cost $100,000 to repair, maybe more. As he descended the grand staircase back to the foyer, David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael Bennett, his son. They hadn't spoken in almost 3 months, and before that, their last conversation had been a tense, uncomfortable exchange about money. Michael had offered to help with bills. David had refused, pride getting in the way of practicality, as it so often did. The conversation had ended badly, with Michael frustrated and David feeling like even more of a failure. David considered not answering. But something about the morning's discovery, about the carved symbols and the word begin, made him press the accept button. Michael's voice was cautious, professionally polite. "Dad, what is it?" Not hello, not how are you, just an immediate assumption that David needed something. It hurt more than David wanted to admit. "I inherited Uncle Harold's property," David said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I wanted to tell you about it. I thought maybe you'd want to see it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The condemned mansion, I saw the obituary." "What do you want, Dad? Money to fix it? Because I told you after last time that I can't keep bailing you out." David felt his throat tighten. "I'm not asking for money. I just found something interesting. Carvings, symbols. I think Harold's estate might be more than we thought." Michael's sigh was audible even through the phone. "Dad, please. Not another project. Remember the boat you were going to restore, the woodworking business? That was going to change everything. You can't save everything you think needs saving." The words landed like physical blows. David had forgotten about the boat. A 30-foot sailboat he'd bought for $5,000 5 years ago, convinced he could fix it up and sell it for a profit. It had sat in a storage yard for 2 years before he had finally admitted defeat and sold it for scrap at a loss. The woodworking business had been even worse, a partnership with another teacher that had collapsed after 6 months and left David $4,000 in debt. "This is different," David said, but even he could hear how weak the words sounded. "It's always different," Michael replied. "Look, I have a meeting in 5 minutes. If you need help selling the land, I can refer you to someone. But I can't watch you chase another fantasy that bankrupts you. I just can't." "I wasn't asking for help," David said quietly. "I just wanted to share something with you." The silence that followed was worse than anger. Finally, Michael said, "I have to go. Email me if you actually sell it." The call ended. David stood in the foyer of Hartwell Manor, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the silence. His son didn't believe in him. Hadn't believed in him for years, if David was being honest. And why should he? David had given Michael plenty of reasons to doubt, plenty of failures to point to as evidence that his father was a dreamer who couldn't execute, a man who saw potential in lost causes but lacked the resources or ability to save them. But this time felt different. The symbols carved into the wall weren't a fantasy. They were real, physical, undeniable. Someone had taken the time to create an elaborate puzzle and hide it in this house. Someone had believed it was worth preserving, worth hiding, worth the effort of ensuring it would be discovered by the right person at the right time. David left the mansion as the sun reached its apex, casting harsh shadows across the overgrown grounds. He locked the door carefully, testing it twice to make sure it was secure. As he walked back to his car, he looked up at the building one more time. In the daylight, with full sunlight illuminating every crack and broken window, the mansion looked even more damaged than it had in the morning's softer light. But David saw something else now, too. He saw possibility. He saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. He saw a chance, however slim, to prove that he was capable of finishing something he'd started. His Honda Civic, a 2008 model with 180,000 miles on the odometer, started on the third try. The engine coughed and rattled before settling into its familiar, uneven rhythm. David pulled away from Hartwell Manor, slowly watching it recede in his rearview mirror, until the trees blocked it from view. He had 90 days, 3 months to figure out what those symbols meant, to understand what Harold had wanted him to find, to salvage something from this inheritance, before the town demolished it and turned it into a vacant lot. He drove straight to the Millbrook Public Library. If anyone in town knew about Edmund Hartwell and the mansion's history, it would be Eleanor Chang. She'd been the head librarian for more than 30 years, and in a town as small as Millbrook, she functioned as the unofficial keeper of local history. More importantly, she was one of the few people David could still call a friend. The library was a modest brick building on Main Street constructed in the 1960s, with the kind of practical architecture that valued function over beauty. Inside it smelled like old books and floor polish, a combination David associated with countless afternoons spent here during his teaching career, researching lesson plans and finding materials for his students. The main room was quiet, just a few patrons scattered among the stacks, and Eleanor was at the front desk, her silver hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose as she worked on her computer. She looked up when David approached, and her face broke into a genuine smile. "David, I was hoping you'd come in. I heard about Harold's will." Eleanor was 68, 10 years older than her husband had been when he died of a heart attack 8 years ago. She and David had grown closer in the years since Sarah's death, two people who understood what it meant to lose a spouse and struggle to find purpose in the aftermath. They'd never been more than friends, but it was a friendship David valued more than he could express. "I need your help," David said, pulling out his phone and showing her the photographs of the carved symbols. "I found these in the mansion. I think they mean something." Eleanor's eyes widened as she studied the images, zooming in to examine details. "Oh my, David, this is remarkable." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "Edmund Hartwell was a genius. Did you know that? Railroad magnate, yes, but also an inventor and a cryptographer. He was obsessed with puzzles and codes." She led him to the local history section, a quiet corner of the library where tall shelves held bound volumes of old newspapers, town records, and family histories. Eleanor pulled several books from the shelves with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was stored. She spread them across a reading table, opening to pages she'd clearly marked years ago for reference. Edmund Hartwell was born in 1854 in Pennsylvania, Eleanor explained, running her finger down a page of text. His family were blacksmiths, poor but skilled. Edmund started working on the railroads at 18, and by the time he was 24, he'd invented an improved brake system that made trains significantly safer. He patented it, sold it, and used the money to invest in railroad stocks and bonds. By 1898, when he built Hartwell Manor, he was one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut. She pulled out a photograph, a sepia-toned image of a distinguished man in his 40s, standing in front of the mansion when it was new. Edmund Hartwell looked directly at the camera with an expression that was both confident and concerned, as if he carried knowledge that weighed on him. David stared at the face and felt an odd sense of recognition. Something about the man's features, the set of his jaw, the depth of his eyes, reminded David of his own reflection. "But here's where it gets interesting," Eleanor continued. "In the 1920s, Edmund became a founding member of something called the Stewardship Society. It was a secret organization, or at least very private, made up of wealthy industrialists and inventors. Their philosophy was that wealth without wisdom creates tyrants. They believed great fortunes should only pass to those who would use them wisely." David leaned forward, his attention fully captured. "What does that mean?" Eleanor pulled out another book, this one of a collection of newspaper articles from the 1920s. "It means they created tests, challenges for their heirs. Some members wrote elaborate wills with impossible conditions. Others hid their fortunes and left clues for family members to follow. Edmund was particularly known for his love of cryptography, but he even published a book about it in 1925. She showed David a photograph of the book's cover, The Language of Secrets, by Edmund Hartwell. "Do we have a copy here?" David asked. Eleanor smiled. "We do. I'll get it for you. But first you need to see this." She pulled out a Hartford Courant newspaper from October 28, 1929, preserved in a protective plastic sleeve. The headline read, "Railroad Baron Vanishes." The article detailed how Edmund Hartwell and his family had disappeared suddenly, leaving behind unpaid bills, confused servants, and a mansion full of furniture. They'd left in the night with a single trunk, and no one in Millbrook had seen or heard from them since. "This was 5 days before the stock market crash that started the Great Depression," Eleanor said. People at the time thought Edmund had predicted the crash and run away to avoid losing his fortune, but others believed he'd hidden his wealth somewhere safe before he left. David felt his pulse quicken. "Do you think that's possible?" Eleanor looked at him seriously. "David, I've lived in this town my entire life. I've heard the stories about Hartwell Manor for decades. Treasure hunters, historians, curious teenagers, they've all explored that house looking for something valuable. No one's ever found anything. But no one's ever found carved symbols like these either." She tapped the phone screen showing David's photographs. If Edmund did hide something, he would have made it challenging to find. Not impossible, but difficult enough that only someone patient and intelligent would succeed. Someone worthy, as he might have said. David stayed at the library until it closed at 6, reading everything Eleanor could find about Edmund Hartwell. He learned that the railroad tycoon had 2 children, William and Margaret, and that William had died in World War I in 1918. Margaret had married a man named Cross and moved away before the family's disappearance. He learned that Edmund had held more than 20 patents for various inventions, most related to railroad safety, but some branching into other areas of mechanical engineering. He learned that the man had been respected, but considered eccentric, known for speaking in riddles and creating elaborate puzzles for his intellectual society friends. Most importantly, David found a thin folder that Eleanor had kept in her personal files donations from Harold Mitchell over the years. His uncle had been systematic about documenting the mansion's history, leaving notes and photographs in the library's collection box every few months. One note dated 2018 caught David's attention. It was written in Harold's shaky handwriting, "The house remembers those who listen. Not all treasures are gold." David drove home as the sun set, the autumn sky painted in shades of orange and purple. His studio apartment was in a converted house on the edge of town, a space that cost him $950 a month and consisted of one room with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and barely enough space for a bed and a desk. He'd moved here after Sarah died, unable to stay in the house where they'd raised their children, where every room held memories that were too painful to face daily. He made himself a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast, then spread his notes and photographs across the small desk. The carved symbols from the pantry wall stared back at him from his laptop screen. He compared them to examples from Edmund's cryptography book, which Eleanor had let him borrow. Some of the symbols matched systems Edmund had described, mathematical ciphers and substitution codes that could hide messages in plain sight. David worked until past midnight, his eyes burning from staring at the screen. He was about to give up for the night when his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jennifer, his daughter. His heart jumped. Jennifer almost never initiated contact. The message was brief. "Michael said you're messing with that mansion. Developer called him asking about you. What are you doing?" "This isn't like you." David stared at the message, trying to parse its meaning. A developer had called Michael asking about him. That was strange. The property wasn't even officially listed for sale. How would a developer know he'd inherited it, and why would they contact Michael instead of approaching David directly? He texted back, "What developer?" "What did they say?" The response came 3 minutes later. "Vincent Cross, Cross Development Group. Michael didn't give him any info. Said the guy was fishing for information about your finances and plans for the property." "Be careful, Dad." David opened his laptop and searched for Vincent Cross. The man's company website appeared immediately sleek and professional. Cross Development Group specialized in acquiring distressed properties and converting them into luxury condominiums. Recent projects showed before and after photos of old buildings transformed into expensive modern housing. Vincent Cross himself smiled from an About Us page, a handsome man in his early 40s with prematurely silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that spoke of significant success. But why was he interested in Hartwell Manor? The property wasn't just distressed, it was condemned. The cost of renovation would be astronomical, far more than the land was worth. Unless Vincent knew something David didn't. Unless the rumors about hidden treasure weren't just local folklore. David looked at his phone at Jennifer's message still on the screen. "This isn't like you," she'd written. And she was right. The old David, the David who'd spent the last 8 years drifting through life in a fog of grief and self-doubt, wouldn't have pursued this. He would have taken the easy route, accepted the inevitable demolition, and walked away. But something had changed when he'd seen those carved symbols. Something about the word begin, carved deep into the wood by a man who'd lived a century ago, had awakened a part of David he'd thought was dead. The part that believed in possibility. the part that refused to give up without trying. He looked at Edmund Hartwell's portrait, which he'd photographed at the library. The railroad tycoon stared back at him with that same expression of determination mixed with concern. Two men separated by a century, both facing impossible odds, both trying to leave something meaningful behind. David opened a new document on his laptop and began typing. He didn't know what he was going to find in Hartwell Manor, or if he'd find anything at all. But he knew he was going to try. He was 62 years old. Most of his life was behind him. He'd failed his wife, failed his children, failed at most of the things he'd attempted in the past decade. But this one time, he was going to see it through. He was going to solve Edmund Hartwell's puzzle, whatever it took. Outside his window, Millbrook settled into the quiet rhythms of a small town at night. Somewhere across town, Hartwell Manor stood in darkness, keeping its secrets for one more day. But change was coming. David could feel it in his bones, a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with faith. Faith that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally found something worth fighting for. The Millbrook Public Library opened at 9 in the morning, but David was waiting outside at 8:30, coffee in hand and notebook tucked under his arm. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through possibilities and patterns, seeing those carved symbols every time he closed his eyes. Eleanor arrived at 8:45, her silver hair pulled back in its usual bun, carrying a leather bag that David knew contained her lunch and whatever book she was currently reading. She smiled when she saw him waiting. "I had a feeling you'd be here early. Come on, let's get started before the morning crowd arrives." Inside, Eleanor led him not to the main reading room, but to the basement archives, a climate-controlled space where the library kept its most valuable local history materials. She unlocked a metal cabinet and pulled out a box David had never seen before, one marked simply, "Mitchell Donation, 2015. Your uncle left this with me 10 years ago." Eleanor explained, setting the box on a work table. "He made me promise not to open it until after his death and only to show it to whoever inherited the property. I've been waiting for you to come asking." Inside the box was a leather-bound journal. Its pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting still clear. David recognized the name on the first page immediately: Edmund Hartwell, Private Journal, September to October 1929. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. The entries were dated starting in early September and continuing through late October. Edmund's handwriting was precise and elegant, the product of an education that valued penmanship and clarity of thought. David began reading, and with each entry, the puzzle pieces started fitting together. September 10th, 1929. The signs are unmistakable. The market is a house of cards built on speculation and greed. I have warned my colleagues in the society, but most refuse to see what is coming. I must prepare for the inevitable collapse. My wealth must be preserved, but not for mere survival. It must serve a purpose greater than myself. September 25th. I have begun the construction. Catherine thinks me mad, spending our evenings working on hidden chambers and elaborate mechanisms. The children do not understand why their father has become so secretive, but someday someone will. The puzzle must be complex enough to deter the greedy, yet solvable by someone who values wisdom over wealth. The Stewardship Society's principles must guide this work. Only the worthy should inherit what I am preserving. David looked up at Eleanor. He knew the crash was coming. He saw it before it happened. Eleanor nodded. Edmund was brilliant, but more than that, he was observant. He understood economic patterns in ways most people didn't. Keep reading. October 15th. The chamber is complete. 3 keys I have hidden: the first in the place of nourishment, the second in the place of learning, the third in the place of rest. Only when all 3 are united will the path reveal itself. I have left instructions for Catherine. Should our fears prove true, and we must leave, our legacy will remain waiting for someone with the patience and intelligence to discover it. October 20th. I have created not 1 vault, but 4. The first will test patience. The second will test intellect. The third will test courage. The fourth will test the heart. Only someone who passes all 4 deserves what I have hidden. May they use it wisely and understand that true wealth is not measured in gold, but in how we lift others. The final entry was dated October 23rd, just 1 day before the family's disappearance. Tomorrow we leave. The signs are everywhere. The crash is days away, perhaps hours. This house will remember what happened here. When someone worthy finds these words, they will understand. True wealth is not what you possess, but what you do with what you have been given. The journey begins with a single step. Begin. David sat back, his mind racing. 4 vaults, 4 tests, and the first clue hidden in the place of nourishment, which had to be the kitchen or pantry where he'd found the carved symbols. Edmund had created an elaborate treasure hunt, one designed specifically to ensure that only someone with the right qualities would succeed. Eleanor was watching him carefully. "What are you thinking?" David pulled out his phone and showed her the photographs of the pantry carvings again. "These aren't just decorations. They're a map. Look at the concentric circles. They match the layout of the mansion. The outer circle represents the main structure, and these smaller circles are individual rooms." Eleanor leaned in, studying the images with renewed interest. And the lines connecting them, hidden passages, David said, his excitement growing. Edmund wrote about creating chambers and mechanisms. He must have built secret passages throughout the house. These carvings are showing me where they are. He spent the next 2 hours at the library comparing the pantry symbols to architectural conventions from the late 19th century. Eleanor brought him books on Victorian mansion design, cryptography systems, and railroad engineering. Slowly, methodically, David began to decode the message Edmund had left. The breakthrough came when he noticed that certain symbols repeated in specific patterns. The mathematical equations weren't random. They were coordinates. The star charts weren't decorative. They were directional indicators. And the word "begin" at the center wasn't just an instruction to start, it was pointing to the next location in the sequence. By noon, David had sketched out a rough translation. The pantry wall was telling him that the first vault lay beneath the library, accessible through the basement. The place of nourishment had led him to discover the map. Now he needed to find where that map led, and there was something about a specific key 3 fragments that needed to be assembled. The pantry carving showed one fragment location clearly hidden in a loose board near the floor. Eleanor made them both sandwiches while David worked, and they ate at the research table surrounded by books and notes. "You know," she said quietly, "I haven't seen you this engaged in years, not since before Sarah got sick." The mention of his wife's name brought a familiar ache to David's chest. Sarah had died 8 years ago after a 2-year battle with ovarian cancer. David had been there for all of it, the surgeries and chemotherapy, the hope and despair, but he'd never felt like he'd done enough. He kept working through most of it, needing the structure and income, and the guilt of not being home more had eaten at him ever since. "I buried myself in work because I couldn't face losing her," David admitted. "And after she died, I buried myself in nothing because I'd lost myself too." Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "This puzzle has brought you back to life. Don't let anyone take that away from you." David returned to Hartwell Manor that afternoon, armed with Eleanor's research and a growing sense of purpose. He parked his car in the same spot as before and walked up to the mansion with more confidence than he'd felt in years. The building still looked like it was surrendering to time, but now David saw it differently. It wasn't just a condemned structure, it was a puzzle box, a challenge left by a brilliant man who'd believed that someday someone would care enough to solve it. He went straight to the pantry and found the loose board exactly where the symbols had indicated. Behind it, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved it for nearly a century, was a triangular piece of metal about 3 inches on each side. The surface was engraved with symbols that matched those on the wall. This was the first fragment of the key Edmund had mentioned. David spent the next hour searching the mansion based on the map's clues. In the master bedroom, hidden in a secret compartment, in the headboard of the 4-poster bed, he found the second fragment. In the library, inside a hollow table leg near the window, he discovered the third. When he brought all 3 pieces together, they fit perfectly, forming a complete triangular key with a compass, rose in the center, and intricate symbols around the edges. The assembled key had a strange quality. It seemed to hum faintly in his hand, and when he held it near certain walls, the vibration intensified. David remembered Edmund's journal mentioning the foundation of knowledge, the library, and beneath the library would be the basement. The mansion's basement was accessible through a door off the kitchen, a narrow stairway that descended into darkness. David hadn't ventured down there during his first exploration, put off by the smell of damp and the sound of water dripping somewhere in the shadows. But now, armed with the triangular key and his phone's flashlight, he descended carefully. The basement was a maze of stone corridors and storage rooms. Water had seeped through cracks in the foundation, creating pools on the uneven floor. Old furniture sat stacked against walls, covered in mildew and cobwebs. The mechanical room housed a boiler that hadn't functioned in decades, its pipes corroded and broken. But when David stood in the room directly beneath the library, the key began to vibrate more strongly. He examined the stone walls carefully, looking for anything unusual. The vibration led him to what appeared to be a natural crack in the mortar between stones. But when he looked closer, he saw that the crack formed a perfect triangle, exactly the shape of his assembled key. David inserted the key and turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that spoke of mechanisms dormant for nearly a century, a section of the stone wall began to swing inward. The engineering was remarkable. Edmund had created a counterweight system hidden within the wall's gears and pulleys that still functioned after all these years. The passage beyond was narrow, perhaps 50 feet long, with symbols carved into the walls. David's flashlight beam revealed them as he walked the same patterns from the pantry, repeated and elaborated a visual story of Edmund's journey and philosophy. At the end of the passage, David entered a circular chamber about 20 feet in diameter. His light swept across wooden crates, metal filing cabinets, and glass display cases positioned around the room's perimeter. In the center stood a stone pedestal with a bronze plaque. The plaque read, "Vault 1 Patience. You have found what others abandoned. You have solved what others ignored. Patience is the foundation of wisdom. Your first reward awaits, but remember, what you do with it reveals who you are." David approached the nearest display case, his hands shaking. Inside were stock certificates, dozens of them, from companies he recognized: General Electric, AT&T, Standard Oil, IBM's predecessor. These were stocks Edmund had purchased before the crash companies he'd believed would survive and thrive, and he'd been right. The filing cabinets contained more railroad bonds that had matured decades ago, real estate deeds for properties in major cities, patents that were probably still valuable, insurance policies, and business contracts. In one glass case, David found gold coins, American Eagles, in pristine condition, 50 of them at least. In another, silver certificates and bearer bonds. There was also a leather portfolio, and inside it a letter addressed to the first seeker. David opened it with trembling hands. If you are reading this, you have proven patience beyond what most possess. This first vault contains enough wealth to change your life. Many would stop here satisfied with what they have found. But I ask, are you seeking comfort or are you seeking truth? 3 more vaults await. Each tests a different virtue. The second tests your mind's keenness. The third tests your courage in darkness. The fourth tests what lies in your heart. You may take what is here and leave. No one would blame you. Or you may continue and discover what I truly valued above all gold. The choice reveals your character. Edmund Hartwell. David sat on the cold stone floor surrounded by wealth he could barely comprehend. Even a conservative estimate put the contents of this vault at $5 to $10 million. Stock certificates alone, if they'd appreciated over 96 years, could be worth millions. The gold coins were worth at least $100,000 at current prices. This was real. The treasure was real. And this was only the first vault. But as David read Edmund's letter again, he understood that stopping here would be a failure. Not a financial failure, but a moral one. Edmund had created this test specifically to separate those who sought wealth from those who sought worthiness. Taking the easy reward and walking away would prove David was the former, not the latter. He photographed everything methodically, creating a detailed record. Then he left the vault, sealing it behind him, and climbed back to the mansion's main floor. His phone showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number and 1 text from Jennifer: "Dad, seriously, be careful with that developer. Michael says something's off about him." David sat in the library looking at the carved roses on the fireplace mantel, already knowing they held the clue to the second vault. But before he could investigate further, he heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, he saw a black Mercedes sedan, sleek and expensive. A man stepped out, and David recognized him immediately from the website photos. Vincent Cross, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, walked up to the mansion's front door with the confidence of someone who owned the world. David met him on the porch. "Mr. Bennett," Vincent said, extending his hand. "Vincent Cross, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I've been very interested in this property." "How did you know I'd be here?" David asked, not taking the offered hand. Vincent lowered his hand smoothly, not offended. "Small town. I've been watching the property for years, and when I heard Harold had passed and left it to you, I thought it was time we met. I'd like to make you an offer." "The house isn't for sale," David said. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Bennett. It's just a matter of price. I'm prepared to offer you $200,000 cash, quick closing. You walk away from this money pit with enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life." David studied Vincent's face, looking for any sign that the man knew about the vaults. But Vincent's expression was bland professional, the face of a businessman making a routine offer. "Why do you want it?" David asked. "You'll just demolish it. The land has value. Millbrook is growing. This location is perfect for luxury condominiums." It was a reasonable explanation, but something about Vincent's eagerness bothered David. The man had contacted Michael, had researched David's finances, had been watching the property for years. That wasn't normal behavior for a simple land acquisition. "I need time to think about it," David said. "Of course. But don't take too long. The demolition clock is ticking, and I'd hate to see you lose everything because you waited too long to make a smart decision." After Vincent left, David stood in the foyer thinking. The developer's interest had to be more than just land value. He had to know something about Edmund's treasure, or at least suspect it existed, which meant David was in a race he hadn't known he'd entered. He went straight to the library fireplace and examined the carved roses Eleanor had helped him identify. 13 of them arranged in a Fibonacci spiral, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. The mathematical sequence Edmund had loved. David pressed on the 13th rose and a soft click echoed from deep within the stone. Then with that same grinding sound of ancient mechanisms, the back wall of the fireplace began to swing inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. This was the second vault, the test of intellect, and David was about to discover what Edmund valued more than patience. He descended the stone steps, carefully counting 30 of them before they opened into a hexagonal chamber. Built-in bookshelves lined the walls, and in the center stood an oak desk. On the desk sat an elaborate puzzle box 12 inches on each side, its surface covered in carved symbols representing different cipher systems. A bronze plaque read, "Vault 2 Intellect. Knowledge without application is mere decoration. Wisdom is knowledge in service to others. Open the box by understanding, not force." David spent the next 3 hours working on the puzzle box, using everything he'd learned from Edmund's cryptography book and his own background in history and languages. Each face of the box had to be solved in sequence, each solution revealing part of the internal mechanism. When the final face clicked into place, the box opened like a flower, its panels spreading outward. Inside were 3 items: a small brass key, another journal filled with Edmund's architectural notes and inventory lists, and a letter. "Intelligence is seeing patterns others miss," the letter read. "Wisdom is using that sight to help others see. You have both. The third vault tests whether you have courage to face what most fear. Seek where darkness dwells and souls rest eternal." David was examining the journal's inventory when he heard footsteps above. Someone was walking through the mansion. He froze, listening as the footsteps moved through the library, paused, then approached the fireplace. He quickly packed the puzzle box contents into his backpack and switched off his flashlight, standing in the darkness as the footsteps stopped at the top of the hidden stairs. "Mr. Bennett," a man's voice called down, smooth and cultured. "I know you're down there. We should talk." It was Vincent Cross. The developer had come back, had somehow known David would be in the vault. David didn't respond, waiting in the darkness. After a long pause, the footsteps retreated. David waited 5 more minutes before climbing back up. The library was empty, but his notebook, which he'd left on the window ledge, had been moved. Vincent had been looking through his notes. David left the mansion quickly, his heart pounding. In the driveway, Vincent's Mercedes was gone, but David could see it parked down the street watching. This wasn't just about business anymore. Vincent knew what David was searching for, and he wasn't going to give up easily. David drove to Eleanor's house and told her everything. She listened with growing concern, then went to her study and returned with a folder. "I've been researching Vincent Cross," she said, spreading documents across her kitchen table. "He's been buying properties like Hartwell Manor for 6 years. All of them estates built between 1890 and 1930, all in distress or condemned, and he's demolished every single one." "Why?" David asked. Eleanor pulled out a genealogy chart. "Because Vincent Cross's grandmother was Margaret Hartwell Cross, Edmund's daughter. Vincent is Edmund's great-great-grandson, and he's been searching for the family treasure for years." David stared at the chart, understanding flooding through him. Vincent had a blood claim to the inheritance. If he could prove family connection, he might be able to challenge David's ownership of anything found in the mansion. But there's more, Eleanor said, showing him a copy of Edmund's 1925 will. There's a clause here that might save you. It says that in event of dispute, ownership of hidden assets shall be determined by successful completion of the worthiness challenge. Blood relation holds no claim should a non-relation prove worthier through deed and character. So if I complete Edmund's challenge before Vincent can stop me, the treasure is legally mine, David asked. According to this, yes. But Vincent has resources you don't. Lawyers, money, time. You need to work fast, and you need to document everything. They spent the rest of the evening photographing every page of Edmund's journals and creating a digital record of David's discoveries. By midnight, they had a comprehensive timeline proving David's progress through the vaults. When David finally left, Eleanor walked him to his car. "Be careful," she said. Vincent's father and grandfather were both obsessed with finding this treasure. You're dealing with generational desperation. That makes people unpredictable. David drove home, his mind already working on Edmund's third clue, where darkness dwells and souls rest eternal. It had to mean the cemetery he'd seen on the property map. That would be his next destination. But as he pulled into his apartment parking lot, he saw Vincent's Mercedes in the shadows. The developer was watching, making sure David knew he wasn't giving up. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. David went inside and found a text from Michael, Dad, that Vincent guy filed something with probate court today. His lawyers are claiming ancestral rights to any assets found on the property. Jenny says you need a lawyer. Please call me. The stakes had just escalated. Vincent wasn't just watching anymore. He was taking legal action. David had 90 days before demolition, but now he might have even less time before the courts froze everything. He texted back, "I will, but I need to finish something first. Trust me." Michael's response came quickly. "I don't know if I can trust you, Dad, but I want to. Please don't make me regret it." David looked at Edmund's portrait on his desk. Two men a century apart, both facing impossible odds. But Edmund had succeeded. He'd predicted disaster, preserved his fortune, and created a system to ensure it would be used wisely. If Edmund could do all that, David could solve his puzzle. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about proving to himself and his children that he was capable of finishing what he started. That he was worthy of the second chance Edmund was offering across time. Tomorrow he would face the third test, the test of courage. And whatever darkness waited in that cemetery, David was going to find it. David stood at the edge of the small cemetery as dawn broke over Hartwell Manor, casting long shadows through the ancient oak trees. The burial ground occupied a quarter-acre in the southeast corner of the property, enclosed by a rusted iron fence that leaned at precarious angles. 8 gravestones rose from the overgrown grass, their marble surfaces stained by decades of weather and neglect. 4 of the stones dated back to the 1800s, marking the graves of the family who'd owned the land before Edmund purchased it. But it was the other 4 that captured David's attention. William Hartwell, 1887 to 1918, died in France during the Great War. Margaret Hartwell Cross, 1890 to 1975. Edmund's daughter, the one who'd married and moved away, whose descendants included Vincent Cross. And then the 2 stones that made David's skin prickle with understanding. Edmund Hartwell, 1854 to question mark. Catherine Hartwell, 1860 to question mark. No death dates because the bodies had never been found. The family had disappeared, and these stones were cenotaphs, empty markers for people who died somewhere else if they died at all. David circled the graves slowly, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. The grass was knee-high, dotted with wildflowers that had gone to seed. Small animals had burrowed beneath the fence, creating holes that rainwater had widened into muddy depressions. The place felt forgotten, abandoned even by the town that had once known the Hartwell family. It was Edmund's gravestone that held the answer. David noticed it when the rising sun hit the marble at just the right angle, illuminating symbols carved into the base of the stone, hidden beneath moss and dirt. He knelt down, brushing away the growth with his hands, and revealed the same triangular pattern he'd found in the 3 fragments scattered throughout the mansion. This was the key, the final piece that would unite the others. He pulled the assembled triangle key from his pocket, the metal still warm from being pressed against his chest. The gravestone had a slot carved into its base, disguised so perfectly that you'd never see it unless you were looking for it. David inserted the key and turned it. The mechanism resisted at first gears that hadn't moved in almost a century, protesting the sudden demand. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the morning quiet, the stone itself began to move. The entire base of the gravestone slid sideways, revealing a shaft that descended straight down into darkness. Stone steps spiraled into the earth, narrow and steep, disappearing beyond the reach of daylight. David stood there for a long moment, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the test of courage Edmund had written about. Descending into what was essentially a grave, going underground, into darkness and uncertainty, trusting that a mechanism built 96 years ago would still function safely. Every instinct screamed at him to stop. He was 62 years old, alone on an abandoned property, about to climb down into a hole in the ground that no one knew existed. If something went wrong, if the stairs collapsed, or the shaft flooded, or the mechanism sealed itself, no one would find him for days, maybe weeks. His children barely spoke to him. Eleanor wouldn't worry until he missed their next scheduled library visit. He could die down there and become one more mystery associated with Hartwell Manor. But he thought about Edmund's words in the journal. True courage is not absence of fear, but action despite fear. And he thought about Michael's text from last night, I want to trust you. Please don't make me regret it. His son wanted to believe in him, was choosing to believe in him despite years of disappointment. David couldn't let him down again. He took a breath, turned on his phone's flashlight, and began to descend. The steps were carved from solid stone, worn smooth by time, but still stable. The shaft was barely 3 feet wide, forcing David to turn sideways in places to navigate the spiral. The temperature dropped with each step, and the air grew thick with the smell of earth and minerals. 20 steps down, the natural light from above faded to nothing, leaving only the beam of his flashlight cutting through absolute darkness. At the bottom, the passage opened into a small chamber, maybe 10 feet square. The walls were black, stone smooth and cold to the touch. A single torch mount jutted from the wall, and David used his lighter to ignite it, surprised when the ancient wood caught immediately. Edmund had soaked it in something that preserved it, kept it ready for this moment across nearly a century. The torchlight revealed a bronze plaque mounted on the far wall, Vault 3, Courage. Most fear death. I feared a meaningless life. True courage is not absence of fear, but action despite fear. You descended into darkness seeking light. Your reward is perspective. There was no gold in this vault, no stock certificates or bonds. Instead, a single glass display case stood in the center of the room, and inside it were personal items. 2 wedding rings, simple gold bands that had worn thin with years of use, letters tied with ribbon addressed to William and Margaret in Catherine's elegant handwriting, photographs of the Hartwell family at various stages of life, formal portraits, and candid moments captured on film that had somehow survived underground storage. And one final journal, Edmund's last one, leather-bound and sealed in wax. David broke the seal carefully and opened to the first page. The entry was dated October 23, 1929, the night before the family's disappearance. His hands shook as he read Edmund's final words. We leave at dawn. The crash will come within days, perhaps hours. I've done all I can to preserve our legacy, but Catherine reminds me that our greatest legacy walks beside us in William and Margaret. The vaults I've created are not about wealth. They're about values, patience, intellect, courage, and love. Whoever finds all 4 will understand. The true treasure is the journey that transforms you. We go to Canada to start anew, away from the collapse that will devastate so many. We take only what we can carry and leave behind what we cannot. If we never return to Connecticut, let this house be our testament. Let whoever solves this puzzle know a life well lived is measured not in gold, but in how we lift others. The 4th vault holds what I treasure most, not wealth, but the means to create it, the tools to build a better world. Find it where love dwells eternal, where a family's heart beats strongest. In the center of all things, look up, and you will see the way down. David sat on the cold stone floor, reading the journal by torchlight. Edmund and Catherine had survived. They'd made it to Canada, started over with nothing, and lived out their lives in relative anonymity. Margaret had been 9 years old when they left, old enough to remember, but young enough to adapt. The family had never returned to Millbrook, had never claimed the fortune Edmund had hidden, because they'd found something more valuable, peace, safety, a life unburdened by the collapse that had destroyed so many others. And now, sitting in a chamber Edmund had built as a final test, David understood what the railroad tycoon had been trying to teach. The previous vaults had held material wealth stocks and bonds and precious metals, but this one held only memories and wisdom. The real treasure wasn't the money, it was the transformation that came from pursuing it. The patience to persist, the intelligence to solve problems, the courage to face fears, and the love that made it all meaningful. David carefully photographed every page of the journal, every item in the display case, documenting everything as Eleanor had instructed. Then he climbed back up the narrow stairs, emerging into morning sunlight that felt almost painfully bright after the darkness below. The gravestone mechanism had remained open waiting for him, and he carefully closed it again, returning Edmund's secret to its hiding place. He was walking back toward the mansion when his phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and David answered immediately, expecting news about Vincent's legal filing. Instead, his son's voice was tight with a different kind of urgency. "Dad, where are you right now at the mansion? Why, what's wrong?" Vincent Cross showed up at my office in Boston this morning, walked right past security, sat down in my lobby and waited for me. He wanted to talk about you. David felt ice settle in his stomach. What did he say? That he's going to court Monday to get an injunction. Full seal on the property you banned from entering, all assets frozen pending a genealogy verification. He said his lawyers are confident because he's direct family, and you're just inheriting through Harold, who wasn't blood related to the Hartwells at all. David's mind raced through the implications. Today was Saturday. Monday was 2 days away. He had one more vault to find, and Vincent was about to cut off his access entirely. But that's not all. Michael continued, his voice dropping. "Dad, he offered me money, $2 million if I could convince you to sell to him immediately. He said it would be enough to pay off my mortgage, set up college funds for Emma and Jack, and still have plenty left over. He said you're going to lose in court anyway, and this way the family gets something." David closed his eyes. Vincent was trying to turn his own son against him, using Michael's financial security and his children's future as leverage. It was ruthless and effective because David knew his son's life would genuinely be easier with that money. Michael worked 80-hour weeks at his investment firm, lived in an expensive Boston suburb to access good schools, and carried the stress of providing for his family in one of the country's most expensive cities. "What did you tell him?" David asked, dreading the answer. "I told him to get the hell out of my office," Michael said, and there was something fierce in his voice that David hadn't heard in years. "I told him I don't care if you're chasing windmills or treasure or nothing at all. You're my father, and no amount of money makes it okay for some stranger to try to buy my loyalty." David felt his throat constrict with emotion. "Thank you," he managed to say. "But Dad, you need to understand what you're up against. This guy has serious resources. His law firm is one of the best in New England. If he gets that injunction Monday, you're done. Whatever you're looking for in that mansion, you have about 48 hours to find it." After the call ended, David stood in the overgrown cemetery looking back at the mansion. The fourth vault, the final test. Edmund's clue had been cryptic: where love dwells eternal, where a family's heart beats strongest in the center of all things, look up and you will see the way down. The center of the mansion was the grand foyer where David had first entered, and the heart of a home was traditionally the hearth, the fireplace, the gathering place. But the foyer didn't have a fireplace. He walked back to the mansion, his mind working through possibilities. The center of all things. Look up and you will see the way down. He stood in the foyer in the exact middle of the space and looked up at the elaborate plasterwork on the ceiling, 20 feet above. The patterns were classical scenes from mythology rendered in white plaster against a pale blue background. But there in the very center was something different. A medallion, circular and about 2 feet in diameter, with a pattern that looked like a heart when viewed from directly below. David had walked past this ceiling feature dozens of times without really seeing it. But now, knowing what to look for, he could see that the heart shape was actually a subtle carving, a depression in the plaster that suggested something hollow behind it. And the way the light hit it, there seemed to be a small hole in the center, barely visible from the ground. He needed to get up there. David searched the mansion until he found an old wooden ladder in what had once been a storage closet. It was rickety and uncertain, but it held his weight as he climbed toward the ceiling. Up close, the medallion was clearly a mechanism. The heart shape was actually a keyhole, but not for any key David had found. It was shaped differently, more ornate, and as he examined it, he realized it was meant to hold something specific. He climbed down and pulled out his phone, reviewing the photographs he'd taken of all three vaults. In Vault 2, the puzzle box had contained a small brass key that David had assumed was for the filing cabinets. But what if it had a different purpose? He retrieved it from his backpack and climbed the ladder again. The key fit perfectly. David turned it, and the entire medallion began to rotate. But instead of opening a door or revealing a passage, it activated something else. The floor beneath the foyer began to hum a deep vibration that David could feel through the ladder. Then, with a mechanical precision that was astounding for century-old engineering, the marble floor in the center of the foyer started to descend. David climbed down the ladder and watched in amazement as a circular section of floor about 10 feet in diameter lowered like an elevator. It went down slowly, revealing a shaft lined with brass and copper machinery gears and pulleys and counterweights that Edmund had installed beneath the mansion. The platform descended 40 feet before coming to a smooth stop. David grabbed his backpack and flashlight and stepped onto the platform. There was a lever on one side, and when he pulled it, the platform began to rise again. At the top, he reset the mechanism and climbed back on, riding it down into the depths beneath Hartwell Manor. The shaft opened into a chamber that took David's breath away. This wasn't a small, hidden room like the others. This was a vault the size of a small house, 30 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that rose 15 feet overhead. Skylights, cunningly disguised as decorative elements on the mansion's exterior, let in filtered natural light. The space was beautiful, almost sacred, with polished wood floors and walls lined with built-in shelving and cabinets. A bronze plaque dominated one wall, Vault for Love. This is what I valued above all. Not the wealth in earlier vaults, but the legacy of love and purpose. Use what you found to create what I could not. A world where wealth serves wisdom, where prosperity builds community, where legacy is measured in lives touched, not dollars accumulated. If you've come this far, you are worthy. Not because you found the treasure, but because the journey changed you. Welcome, my distant friend, to the completion. In the center of the room stood a large desk, and on it sat an ornate wooden box. David opened it with trembling hands and found a stack of legal documents professionally drawn up and notarized in 1929. The top document was titled the Hartwell Legacy Foundation, Articles of Incorporation and Trust Agreement. David read through the papers, his eyes widening with each page. Edmund had established a legal trust naming specific law firms as trustees, firms that David recognized because they still operated in Connecticut nearly a century later. The trust stipulated that whoever completed all 4 vault challenges would become the primary trustee regardless of blood relation to the Hartwell family. The assets held in trust were to be used for specific purposes: education, community development, historic preservation, innovation, support, and family security. Beneath the legal documents was an inventory, and the numbers made David dizzy. Stock certificates from companies that had not only survived the Depression, but had become dominant forces in American industry. Property deeds for buildings in Boston, New York, and Chicago that were now worth fortunes. Government bonds that had been accumulating compound interest for 96 years. Gold and silver in quantities that represented millions of dollars at current market prices. The total value, conservatively estimated, exceeded $500 million. But the final document was a letter, and it was this that brought tears to David's eyes. Edmund had addressed it simply to the worthy. You've completed what took me a lifetime to build. This foundation is now yours to steward. Use 80% for community benefit. Keep 20% for your family's security. Ensure your children and grandchildren understand wealth is a responsibility, not a right. I never had the chance to build this foundation myself. Fate took me elsewhere, and Catherine and I chose peace over wealth, family over fortune. But I trusted that someday someone would find what I'd hidden. Someone patient enough to decode the symbols, intelligent enough to solve the puzzles, courageous enough to descend into darkness, and loving enough to understand that the greatest treasure is the opportunity to help others. That someone is you. Thank you for being worthy. Thank you for persevering. Thank you for understanding that the true treasure was never the gold. It was becoming the person capable of handling it wisely. Your friend across time, Edmund Hartwell. David sat at the desk and wept. He wept for the years he'd wasted in grief and self-doubt. He wept for the relationship with his children that he'd nearly destroyed through absence and pride. He wept for Sarah, who would never see this moment, but who would have been so proud. And he wept with relief and gratitude that Edmund Hartwell, a man who died before David was born, had believed enough in the possibility of worthiness to create this elaborate test. He spent the next 6 hours in the vault photographing every document, creating a detailed inventory, and understanding the scope of what he discovered. The trust documents were legally binding and had been maintained by the designated law firms for nearly a century, waiting for someone to trigger the completion clause. The assets were real, verified, and properly recorded. Edmund had thought of everything. It was late afternoon when David finally ascended the platform back to the foyer. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and overwhelmed by the responsibility he'd just accepted. But he was also more certain of his purpose than he'd been in decades. This wasn't just about saving himself or proving something to his children. This was about honoring Edmund's vision and using incredible resources to make a real difference. His phone showed 17 missed calls and a dozen text messages. Most were from Eleanor, worried because he hadn't checked in. 2 were from Michael. 1 was from Jennifer, and seeing her name made his heart skip. She never called. He listened to her voicemail first. "Dad, it's Jenny. Michael told me what Vincent tried to do. I've been looking into this guy's legal strategy, and I think I can help. I'm driving up from New York tomorrow. We need to talk before Monday." His daughter, who hadn't volunteered to help him with anything in 5 years, was coming to Millbrook. David called her back immediately, and she answered on the first ring. "Dad, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours. I found it, Jenny. I found what Edmund Hartwell hid. And it's not just treasure, it's a foundation, a legal trust, everything we need to fight Vincent's claim." He heard her sharp intake of breath. "You're serious. You actually found a real treasure." "I found what Edmund wanted someone to find. And according to his trust documents, completing the challenge makes me the legal trustee. Vincent's blood relationship doesn't matter." Jenny was quiet for a moment, and David could almost hear her lawyer's mind processing the implications. "Dad, I need to see those documents. If they're authentic and properly executed, you might actually have a case. A good one." They talked for an hour, David explaining the vaults and the tests, while Jenny asked precise legal questions about dates, witnesses' notarization, and the law firms involved. By the end of the conversation, she sounded cautiously optimistic. "I'm leaving New York at 6 tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll be there by 10. Don't talk to Vincent, don't sign anything, and for God's sake, don't go back into that mansion until I've seen the trust documents. If this is real, if it's as solid as you think, we can fight this, but we need to be smart about it." After hanging up with Jenny, David called Eleanor and gave her the condensed version of his discoveries. She listened in amazed silence, then said, "David, you need to understand what's about to happen. When this becomes public, when people learn about a $500 million treasure found in Millbrook, your life will never be the same. The media, the attention, the pressure. Are you ready for that?" David looked around the foyer of Hartwell Manor, at the grand staircase and stained glass windows, at the space that had seemed like nothing but a burden when he'd first inherited it. "I've spent 8 years being invisible, Eleanor, hiding from life because I was afraid of failing again. Maybe it's time to be visible, to matter, to do something that outlasts me." That evening, David sat in his small apartment and wrote an email to Michael and Jenny. He told them everything, holding nothing back. The symbols in the vaults, the tests and the treasure, Edmund's vision, and the trust he'd created. He attached photographs of the documents and explained what he thought it all meant. Then he wrote something he should have written years ago. "I know I failed you both when your mother was sick. I wasn't there enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't the father you deserved. I've been trying to apologize with words, but words are cheap. So instead, I'm going to show you. This foundation that Edmund created, this opportunity to use wealth for good, I want you both to be part of it. Not because you're my children, but because you're exactly the kind of people Edmund was hoping would inherit this responsibility. Smart, ethical, capable. You're the legacy I'm most proud of, even if I didn't do enough to help you become who you are." He hesitated before clicking send, wondering if he was being too emotional, too vulnerable. Then he thought about Edmund's letter. "Thank you for being worthy," and he sent the email. Michael's response came 20 minutes later. "Dad, I'm on the first flight to Hartford tomorrow morning. We're going to court Monday together. All of us. Jenny's response was even shorter. See you at 10. Bring coffee. David went to bed that night knowing that Monday would bring a fight unlike anything he'd experienced. Vincent Cross would have expensive lawyers and legal precedents and every advantage that money could buy. But David had something Vincent had never managed to obtain: completion of Edmund's challenge. He had solved the puzzles, passed the tests, and proven himself worthy according to the criteria established by the man whose fortune they were fighting over. More importantly, David had his children back. Not completely, not yet, but they were coming to stand beside him. Michael, who doubted him for so long, was flying across the country to help. Jenny, who'd kept him at arm's length for years, was driving through the night to offer her legal expertise. They believed in him again, or at least they were choosing to believe, and that mattered more than any treasure. Sunday morning arrived with Jennifer pulling into the library parking lot exactly at 10, carrying a briefcase and 2 cups of coffee from the Dunkin' Donuts on the highway. Michael's rental car arrived 30 minutes later, and David watched his son emerge looking tired and determined. They met in Eleanor's reading room where David had spread out all his documentation, and for the next 6 hours they worked. Jennifer reviewed the trust documents with the careful attention of someone whose career depended on finding flaws in legal agreements. Michael analyzed the financial inventory, his investment banking background, giving him insights into the current value of century-old assets. Eleanor provided historical context and documentation about the Stewardship Society and Edmund's known legal arrangements. And David told them the whole story from the first carved symbol to the final vault, explaining Edmund's philosophy and the test he'd created. By late afternoon, Jennifer leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Dad, this is bulletproof. The trust was properly established, properly maintained, and the completion clause is clear. Vincent can claim blood relation all he wants, but Edmund explicitly wrote that worthiness supersedes heredity. If we can prove you completed the challenges, which we can with your photographs and documentation, then the trust names you as the legal steward." Michael was looking at spreadsheets on his laptop, running calculations. "The assets are legitimate. I cross-referenced the stock certificates against historical records, and they're all real. Some of these companies went through mergers and splits, which actually multiplied their value. Dad, the conservative estimate is low. This trust is worth closer to $700 million. The number still didn't feel real to David. He'd spent his entire adult life counting pennies, making do with secondhand everything, worrying about bills and retirement and whether he'd have enough to survive. And now he was being told he controlled a fortune that could fund schools and hospitals and entire communities. What matters, he said quietly, is that Edmund wanted it used wisely. He created the foundation structure for a reason. 80% for community benefit, 20% for family security. That's the deal, and I'm not changing it." Jennifer looked at her father with an expression he hadn't seen in years: respect. "That's exactly the right answer, Dad, and it's exactly what will win in court. Vincent is arguing that he deserves the money because of who he is. You're arguing that you deserve the stewardship because of who you've become." Edmund made it clear which one matters more. They worked through the evening, preparing documents and strategy for Monday's court hearing. Michael called colleagues in Boston to get recommendations for Connecticut attorneys who specialized in estate law. Jennifer drafted a response to Vincent's petition outlining David's completion of the challenge and the trust's explicit provisions. Eleanor compiled historical documentation about Edmund's known wishes and the Stewardship Society's principles. At midnight, exhausted but prepared, they finally stopped. Michael looked at his father across the table and said, "You know, Mom would be proud of you, right? Not because of the money, because you didn't give up." David felt his eyes sting with tears. "Your mother believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I wish she could see this." "She can," Jenny said softly, "and she's probably laughing at how typical it is that you'd stumble into the opportunity of a lifetime and your first thought would be giving most of it away." They slept in Eleanor's spare bedrooms, the 3 of them under one roof for the first time in years. David lay awake for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling, thinking about Edmund Hartwell and the journey that had led him here. Somewhere across a century of time, a railroad tycoon had built an elaborate puzzle and trusted that eventually someone would solve it. Someone who valued patience and intelligence and courage and love. Someone who would use incredible wealth not for personal gain, but for collective good. David had never thought of himself as that someone. He'd spent most of his life feeling inadequate, always falling short of his own expectations and everyone else's. But Edmund's tests hadn't been about perfection. They'd been about persistence, about being willing to try, even when success seemed impossible, about caring more about doing right than doing well. Monday morning would bring Vincent Cross and his lawyers in a legal battle over one of the largest hidden fortunes in American history. But tonight, David Bennett was at peace. He'd completed Edmund's challenge. He'd reconciled with his children. He'd discovered that worthiness wasn't something you were born with, but something you earned through choices made in moments of doubt and fear. The house remembered just as Harold's note had promised. And what it remembered was that true treasure is never found, only earned by those willing to see beyond what others have given up on. David had seen beyond the ruined mansion to the puzzle within. He'd seen beyond his own failures to the possibility of redemption. And most importantly, he'd seen that at 62 years old, with most of his life behind him, he could still become someone worth being. The courtroom at Millbrook County Courthouse had been packed that Monday morning, news of the treasure discovery having leaked despite David's attempts at discretion. Vincent Cross had arrived with 3 lawyers from a prestigious Boston firm, their expensive suits and leather briefcases projecting an air of inevitable victory. David had sat at the plaintiff's table with Jennifer beside him, Michael in the row behind, and Eleanor in the gallery offering silent support. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, had listened to Vincent's attorneys present their case. They'd argued blood relation, family heritage, and the principle that Edmund Hartwell's fortune should remain within the Hartwell family line. They'd produced genealogical records, historical documents, and expert testimony about inheritance law. Then Jennifer had stood, and in her calm, precise lawyer's voice, she'd presented David's case. The trust documents properly executed and maintained for 96 years. The completion clause that superseded all blood claims. The photographs documenting David's journey through all 4 vaults, each image time-stamped and geotagged. Edmund's own words written in letters and journals, making clear that worthiness was measured not by ancestry, but by character. The moment that changed everything had come when Jennifer played a recording. One of the law firms Edmund had designated as trustee had maintained audio records of Edmund's verbal instructions recorded in 1929 on primitive equipment, but still audible. Edmund's voice, crackling with age but unmistakable in its intent, had filled the courtroom. Let it be known that my fortune is not a birthright to be claimed by blood, but a responsibility to be earned through deed. Whoever completes the 4 tests has proven themselves worthy. Their relation to me by blood or marriage is irrelevant. What matters is their relation to the principles I hold dear: patience, intellect, courage, and love. Judge Morrison had recessed for 2 hours. When she returned, her ruling had been swift and decisive. The trust documents were valid. David Bennett had completed the challenge as stipulated. Vincent Cross's blood relation, while documented and acknowledged, did not supersede the explicit terms Edmund Hartwell had established. David Marshall Bennett was hereby recognized as the legal trustee of the Hartwell Legacy Foundation. Vincent had stood to leave his face a careful mask hiding whatever emotions churned beneath. But as he passed David's table, he'd paused. "You solved it," he'd said quietly, and there was something in his voice that might have been relief. "My father died, broken, chasing this. My grandfather before him. Maybe we weren't supposed to find it. Maybe that was Edmund's final message to us." David had stood and extended his hand. "The foundation will need advisors, people who understand real estate development and historic preservation. If you're interested, there's a place for you in this." Vincent had stared at David's outstretched hand for a long moment, then taken it. "Why would you offer me that?" "Because Edmund wanted his legacy to help people. Your people. Your family's obsession hurt you. Let's turn that into something positive." Now, 6 months later, David stood on the restored front steps of Hartwell Manor and watched the afternoon tour group gather in the grand foyer. The mansion gleamed with fresh paint in its original Victorian colors, cream with hunter green trim and burgundy accents. The windows had been replaced, the roof rebuilt, the plumbing and electrical systems brought up to modern code while preserving the historical character. The restoration had cost $8 million, but it had been worth every penny. The building now served multiple purposes. The first floor was a museum dedicated to Edmund Hartwell's life and the history of the Stewardship Society. Visitors could see the carved symbols that had started David's journey, the puzzle box from Vault 2, and carefully curated items from all four vaults. Interactive displays let people try simplified versions of Edmund's puzzles, and a timeline showed the economic context of 1929 and Edmund's prescient escape. The second floor housed the Foundation's offices. David's workspace was modest, a sunny room overlooking the gardens that were slowly being restored to their 1920s glory. His salary as Foundation director was $80,000 a year, generous, but not extravagant enough to live comfortably in the restored caretaker's cottage, where he now made his home. The third floor had been converted into meeting rooms and a small auditorium where the Foundation hosted educational programs. This afternoon, 50 high school students from 3 local schools were attending a workshop on financial literacy and community investment, taught by volunteers from the Foundation's growing network of supporters. Michael appeared at David's elbow, his 7-year-old daughter Emma and 4-year-old son Jack trailing behind him. His son had taken a consulting position with the Foundation, flying up from Boston twice a month to advise on investment strategy and asset management. The arrangement worked well, giving Michael meaningful work that aligned with his values while still maintaining his primary career. "The kids want to show you something in the library," Michael said, smiling. "Emma's been practicing the Fibonacci sequence." David followed his grandchildren into the library, now fully restored, with books lining the shelves again. Emma led him to the fireplace and proudly counted the roses, pointing to each one. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. "Very good," David said, kneeling down to her level. "Do you know why those numbers are special? Because they're a pattern," Emma said confidently. "Each number is the sum of the two before it, and patterns help us understand the world." David felt his throat tighten with pride. "That's exactly right. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather Edmund believed that understanding patterns was one of the most important things a person could learn." Jennifer arrived as the sun began to set, her car pulling into the now-paved driveway. She'd taken on the role of Foundation legal counsel on retainer handling contracts, grant agreements, and the complex regulatory requirements of managing a charitable trust. She'd also found something unexpected: purpose that went beyond billable hours and partnership track. She found David in his office reviewing applications for the Foundation's small business grant program. In 6 months, they'd awarded funding to 23 local entrepreneurs, helped save 3 historic buildings from demolition, and established scholarship funds for 127 students. The numbers still amazed David. The Foundation's endowment, conservatively invested, generated approximately $20 million annually. Of that, $16 million went to programs and grants. $2 million covered operational costs, including salaries for the 12 full-time staff members. $2 million went into reserves for special projects. The remaining 20% of the trust, approximately $140 million, had been divided as Edmund specified. $40 million for David, structured to provide security without extravagance. $50 million for Michael and his family. $50 million for Jennifer and any future children she might have. The money was held in trust, designed to prevent waste while allowing freedom. But the real change wasn't the money. It was what the journey had restored: family. Michael called every week now, sometimes just to talk, rebuilding the relationship that had fractured during Sarah's illness and death. Jennifer visited monthly, often staying the weekend in the mansion's guest quarters. And the grandchildren, Emma and Jack, knew their grandfather not as the distant, grief-stricken man of David's worst years, but as someone who'd accomplished something remarkable. Dad, Jenny said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I've been going through the historical records Eleanor compiled, and I found something interesting." She pulled out a folder. Margaret Hartwell, Edmund's daughter, wrote letters to friends in Millbrook for years after the family left. She died in Toronto in 1975, but she had children and grandchildren. David leaned forward. Vincent's line. "Not just Vincent, there are others. Cousins who never knew about the treasure who built normal lives in Canada." And Dad, in her last letter written a month before she died, Margaret mentioned something. She said her father had belonged to a group of wealthy men who all created similar puzzles. She said there were 3 others, 3 more treasure hunts that were never solved. David looked at his daughter, seeing the gleam of excitement in her eyes that mirrored what he'd felt 6 months ago standing before Hartwell Manor's gates. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Jennifer smiled. "The Hartwell Foundation's mission includes supporting historic preservation and education. What better way to fulfill that mission than to help other families discover what Edmund created? To find those worthy seekers he believed in, before David could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway slightly out of breath. David, you need to see this. She held out an envelope, old and yellowed, with a Toronto postmark dated 1975. Inside was a letter written in an elderly woman's shaky handwriting. To whoever manages my father's estate, I am Margaret Hartwell, Cross Williams' daughter of Edmund and Catherine Hartwell. I am 85 years old, and my doctors tell me I haven't much time left. I never returned to Millbrook, never claimed my father's fortune because he taught me that some things matter more than money. But I know he created his puzzle hoping someone would find it. Someone who needed not just the wealth, but the transformation that comes from proving yourself worthy. If you're reading this, you must be that person. My father was part of a society of men who believed great fortunes should serve great purposes. He wasn't alone in creating these challenges. There were three others: Harrison Blackwell of Boston, who built a puzzle into his textile mill; Catherine Price of Newport, who hid her shipping fortune in her mansion; and Thomas Ashford of Philadelphia, whose railroad empire concealed secrets similar to my father's. None of these puzzles have been solved. Perhaps they're waiting for someone like you, someone who understands that the greatest treasure isn't what you find, but who you become while searching for it. Use my father's gift wisely. And if you're so inclined, help others discover theirs. With gratitude and hope, Margaret Hartwell, Cross Williams. David read the letter 3 times, then looked at the faces around him. His daughter, brilliant and passionate. His son, whose footsteps he could hear in the hallway as Michael returned from the tour. Eleanor, who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And beyond his office window, Hartwell Manor stood in the golden light of late afternoon, transformed from a symbol of failure into a beacon of possibility. The foundation would grow, he knew. The work would expand, and perhaps someday they would help others find their own Hartwell Manors, their own tests of worthiness, their own chances at redemption. But tonight, David would have dinner with his children and grandchildren in the restored dining room where Edmund Hartwell's family had gathered a century before. They would sit at the long table, now polished and gleaming, and share a meal beneath the same roof that had witnessed one man's vision and another man's rebirth. 2 portraits hung side by side in the main hall. On the left, Edmund Hartwell and his family, photographed in 1925. On the right, David Bennett with Michael, Jennifer, Emma, and Jack, photographed just last month. Between them, a brass plaque read, "Two families 100 years apart, united by courage, wisdom, and love. Legacy is not what we leave behind, but who we become in the journey." The Hartwell Legacy Foundation, established 1929, fulfilled 2026, David stood before the portraits as the evening tour ended, and visitors filed out, their voices echoing in the foyer as they discussed what they'd learned. He thought about the morning he had first stood here, broke and broken, seeing nothing but another failure waiting to happen. He thought about Sarah and how she'd always believed he was capable of more than he believed himself. She'd been right. He thought about Edmund Hartwell, who trusted that someday, across the vast gulf of time, someone would care enough to solve his puzzle. Someone who would use the treasure not for selfish gain, but for collective good. And he thought about the word that had started everything carved deep into a pantry wall nearly a century ago: begin. At 62, David Marshall Bennett had begun again. He discovered that it was never too late to change, never too late to prove yourself worthy, never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. Outside, the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Hartwell Manor stood solid and beautiful, its secrets revealed but its magic intact. And somewhere in Boston, Newport, and Philadelphia, 3 more puzzles waited. 3 more chances for transformation. 3 more opportunities for someone to discover that true treasure is never found, only earned by those willing to see beyond what others have given up on. But that was a story for another day. Tonight, David had everything he needed: family purpose and the knowledge that he'd taken his one last chance and made it count. The house remembered. And what it remembered was that sometimes the greatest victories come not from never falling, but from finding the courage to rise one more time. David switched off the lights in his office and headed toward the dining room, where the sound of his grandchildren's laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for too long. The Hartwell Legacy Foundation had work to do, lives to touch, and futures to build. But first there was dinner to share, and love to celebrate, and a family to cherish. Some treasures, after all, couldn't be locked in vaults or measured in dollars.